A hypothetical World War III could dramatically reshape borders across the globe. Any analysis depends on key assumptions. We can't cover every scenario. We'll assume limited nuclear weapons use without full nuclear war, and we'll extrapolate based on current information and past regime actions. The only likely path to WWII today is Russia and China allied against NATO. Neither Russia nor China could defeat the US and NATO alone. However, together they control vast resources. Militaries, and China wields economic influence, so an alliance could prevail. NATO has the most powerful military, with better weapons and tactics than Russia or China. But various scenarios could shift the odds. The main sides would be NATO plus allies like Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and parts of Latin America. Russia and China would be joined by North Korea, Belarus, Syria, Iran, and some former Soviet states. Many Latin American and African nations, especially those indebted to China, might also join. NATO has 31 countries, most European plus the US and Canada. Russia heads the smaller Collective Security Treaty Organization with former Soviet states. Its Article 4 calls for mutual defense, like NATO's Article 5. Let's examine some scenarios and possible border changes. Some outcomes may be unexpected given supposed alliances. But a more hopeful picture will emerge unless you favor the authoritarian victors. Scenario 1. Russia's nightmare. After over a year of war in Ukraine, Putin uses a small tactical nuke. NATO declares war in response, attacking Russia conventionally without nuclear escalation. Russia invokes the CSTO's Article 4. Putin urges other authoritarian regimes to help fight NATO's spread, but most remain neutral, fearing retaliation. Only Iran and Syria, dependent on Russia, join in. Critically, China refuses to assist, opposing Russia's first use of nukes. NATO's superior forces quickly capture Moscow. After severe sanctions and worsening conditions, Russians put up little fight to keep Putin. He's found dead, apparently assassinated. NATO dismantles Russia's allies' governments. Without China's help, Russia can't win, even with some regional allies. North Korea especially wouldn't join unless permitted by China, who withholds support here. After the war, Russia is divided into smaller, more manageable countries based on its federal districts, with pro-Western democracies in the Western districts. China might claim the resource-rich Far Eastern, Siberian districts. The Middle East sees little change. Scenario 2. China joins Russia. To preserve authoritarianism, China secretly teams up with Russia against the West's encroaching influence. They convince other single-party regimes to join by warning that the West threatens them all. Leveraging debts and economic ties, China pulls Latin American and African nations to their side. With global allies and resources, China and Russia defeat NATO. China claims East Asia, with puppet governments if needed. South and North Korea unify under Kim Jong-un's rule. Mongolia maintains autonomy by siding with China-Russia but is controlled by Beijing. The Middle East keeps existing borders but supplies oil and gas to the victors. India is divided between China, Pakistan, and a Beijing-controlled southern state. Russia annesses Scandinavia, the Baltics, and Ukraine. Germany retains borders by appeasing Russia economically but is a puppet state. The rest of continental Europe becomes the European Communist Federation under Russian control. The UK is also annexed or made a puppet. The US loses Alaska and the Southwest to Russia and Mexico, the Northwest to China, the Southeast to a communist Cuba. And the Northeast, Central regions become demilitarized remnants. Canada, relying on resources, remains autonomous but controlled. Latin American borders don't change much since many nations already rely on China, but Chinese allies like Brazil and Chile gain power. Africa sees little border change but becomes a manufacturing hub and resource source for the new empires, increasing Chinese-Russian-aligned nations' regional power. Scenario 3. NATO wins. Currently, NATO maintains military dominance. Even with some allies, Russia and China likely can't defeat the combined NATO forces. Russia can't even beat much smaller Ukraine. And while China rapidly modernizes its military, it lags behind NATO in technology and experience. If NATO wins, Russia again breaks into separate states run by elected governments, overseen by the West. But occupied Russia may become lawless, with ongoing rebellions against westernization and fluid borders between warlords' territories. Either way, a divided Russia can't threaten the world again. China's vast population complicates its reorganization after defeat. To enable functional elected governments, China may split along ethnic lines: an independent Tibet, Taiwan and Mongolia, a democratic China centered around Beijing, and other regions incorporated into neighboring states. North and South Korea reunify under Seoul's democratic government. Oppressive regimes elsewhere collapse with China's and Russia's, transitioning to democracy through popular revolutions rather than border changes. Ukraine regains Crimea, while Belarus joins Western Russia. Africa, South America and the South Pacific likely see minimal border changes, unless local conflicts arise amid the chaos. But the world map will be rewritten after any WWII outcome. Unless full nuclear war erupts, ending borders and nations entirely as humanity struggles to survive. To further expand on these scenarios and their implications. In Scenario 1, Russia's reliance on authoritarian allies proves misguided, as most remain neutral rather than face NATO retaliation. Russia's fantasy of a grand anti-Western coalition vanishes. And critically, the unilateral use of nuclear weapons costs Russia its key Chinese ally. In isolation, Russia stands no chance against the full might of NATO. Its military quickly crumbles. This scenario highlights the ongoing tensions between democratic and authoritarian regimes. Ultimately, these political differences override any allegiance between Russia and its supposed partners. While a shared anxiety of Western influence provides some common ground, when facing an existential threat, most authoritarian nations prioritize self-preservation. They rightly judge that open war against NATO, especially with nukes in play, is suicidal. Only the most dependent allies sacrifice themselves for Russia's lost cause. Russia's fragmentation after defeat aims to permanently eliminate its imperialist threat. But occupied zones descending into warlord control reveal the limits of reshaping regimes by force. Rebuilding functional governance in a land that historically rejects outsiders proves intractable. At best, the West can secure a partitioned Russia and hope the untamed frontier consumes itself in petty fiefdoms. China limiting its involvement proves wise. By withholding reinforcements, Beijing avoids nuclear entanglement and preserves global standing after Russia's fall. This mirrors China's moderation in the actual Ukraine crisis, taking a neutral posture despite close Russia ties. China's non-intervention lets it pick up the pieces after Russia's demise, expanding subtle influence over resource-rich Siberian territories through economic and political means rather than costly war. Scenario 2 illustrates how a Sino-Russian alliance could leverage authoritarian solidarity and economic clout into a dominant anti-Western bloc. Here China pulls strings, not only convincing wayward regimes to join the war, but also using its financial sway over developing nations to expand the alliance. This portrays a bifurcated world, divided along ideological lines. In victory, the authoritarians consolidate their power. NATO is dismantled, its democracies replaced by dictatorial regimes under China and Russia's thumbs. After defeating the leading democracies, Beijing and Moscow have free rein to expand borders and vassalize neighbors. Unconstrained by Western rivals, communist powers rule their growing spheres of influence. This scenario's realism is questionable, however. Russia currently shows no strength capable of conquering Europe, even with reinforcements. And many nations maintaining neutrality seems more plausible than active participation. Additionally, China has refrained from directly confronting the West despite increasing assertiveness. But hypothetically, an emboldened Sino-Russian bloc could threaten world democracy. In Scenario 3, NATO maintains its advanced military standing and united coalition. Defeating Russia and China discredits authoritarian regimes, precipitating democratic revolutions worldwide. But transitioning defeated nations to stable democracies proves difficult. Resistance persists in occupied zones. And national fragmentation risks creating weak states unable to suppress terrorist or criminal factions, further destabilizing regions. While this outcome removes threatening communist powers, cradling new democracies requires sustained effort. Western nations must balance liberalization with pragmatism when reshaping fallen regimes. Progress must come incrementally, focused on reforms with local support. The path to lasting change emerges carefully along with new national identities. With NATO prevailing, Russia and China's fragmentation aims to permanently eliminate their imperialist threat. But occupied zones descending into warlord control reveal the limits of reshaping regimes by force. Rebuilding functional governance in lands that historically reject outsiders proves intractable. At best, the West can secure partition zones and hope the untamed frontiers consume themselves in petty fiefdoms. Transitioning these troubled regions into stable democracies will test Western resolve and wisdom. This imagined exercise highlights how global war could drastically reshape the geopolitical landscape based on complex factors and unpredictable alliances. With nuclear brinksmanship, even limited warfare risks escalating into an apocalypse erasing all nations. While hypothetical, these scenarios illustrate potential pressures, motivations, and outcomes that could follow should global superpowers ever enter direct war. They provide perspective on the forces determining friends and foes in a divided world.